In 2022, a team of researchers at the University of Chicago ran a simple experiment. They showed 100 people pictures of some of the most recognizable icons on the planet. Characters, logos, and mascots that collectively have been seen billions of times. Pikachu, the Monopoly Man, Curious George, the fruit of the Loom logo. Things you have looked at since childhood, things burned so deep into your visual memory that you could probably sketch them on a napkin right now without thinking. The researchers showed 3 versions of each icon. 1 was the real one. 2 were altered. All the participants had to do was pick the correct version. 1 out of 3. You should get this right by pure chance 33% of the time, even if you have never seen the thing in your life. For 7 of those icons, people performed at or below chance. They could not identify the real version of something they had seen thousands of times. And here is what makes this genuinely unsettling. They did not pick randomly. They picked the same wrong version, consistently, with extraordinary statistical reliability. The researchers measured a split-half consistency of 0.92 for correct responses and 0.88 for incorrect ones, both statistically significant to a degree that essentially rules out coincidence. People are not guessing. They are remembering. They are remembering something that never existed. Nearly half of participants drew a monocle on the Monopoly Man when asked to sketch him from memory. He has never worn one. They drew a tail on Curious George. He has never had one. They placed a cornucopia behind the fruit of the Loom logo, a detail the company has officially confirmed has not appeared in over 170 years of manufacturing. They gave Pikachu a black tip on his tail. His tail is solid yellow. The black tips are on his ears, and the most disturbing finding came in the drawing task. Even after being shown the correct version, even after being told which one was real, participants drew the icons from memory minutes later and made the exact same errors. Seeing the truth was not enough to override whatever was already in their heads. The researchers called these visual Mandela effects. The name comes from a strange conversation that took place at Dragon Con in Atlanta in 2009, when a paranormal writer named Fiona Broome realized she was not the only person who vividly remembered Nelson Mandela dying in a South African prison in the 1980s. She remembered news clips of his funeral. She remembered the mourning, the rioting, the speech from his widow. Others at the convention shared the same memories. The details were specific, emotional, and felt completely real. Nelson Mandela did not die in prison. He was released in 1990, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1993, became South Africa's first democratically elected president in 1994, and died at home in Johannesburg on December 5, 2013. He was 95 years old. Broome gave the phenomenon a name and launched a website, and within a few years, millions of people were discovering they shared the same impossible memories. The Berenstain Bears, the children's book series, created by Stan and Jan Berenstain, a Jewish family whose name traces back to Ukrainian immigrants in the 1880s. The spelling has always been Berenstein, with an A. Dr. Seuss himself edited the first book and put the name on the cover in 1962. Over 400 titles, roughly 260 million copies sold, and yet an enormous number of people would bet money it was spelled Berenstein. with an E, a viral blog post in August of 2012 literally titled "The Discrepancy as Proof We Are Living in a Parallel Universe." There is the line from The Empire Strikes Back. Almost everyone remembers Darth Vader saying, "Luke, I am your father." He never says, "Luke." The actual line is, "No, I am your father." The movie came out in 1980 and has been watched by hundreds of millions of people, and almost all of them remember a line that was never spoken. The genie movie Shazam, starring the comedian Sinbad, which millions of people born in the late 80s and early 90s distinctly remember watching. Sinbad has never made a genie movie. It does not exist. There was a movie called Kazam in 1996, starring Shaquille O'Neal as a genie, and Sinbad once hosted a movie marathon wearing a genie-like costume. But Shazam is not real. Sinbad himself tweeted about it in 2016, pointing out that nobody his own age seems to remember this movie. Only the people who were children in the 90s. The mirror quote from Snow White. The evil queen actually says, "Magic mirror on the wall." The Kit Kat hyphen that never existed. The company confirmed it in 2016, and the fruit of the Loom cornucopia, which is maybe the strangest one of all, because in 1994, a Florida newspaper described the logo as initially a cornucopia, swollen with an apple, green grapes, purple grapes. The false memory predates the internet. It predates the name Mandela Effect. People were misremembering a cornucopia that never existed before anyone told them to. Now, when this phenomenon exploded online around 2016, when the subreddit hit hundreds of thousands of subscribers and YouTube videos racked up millions of views, the explanations people reached for were extraordinary. Parallel universes, quantum mechanics, the Large Hadron Collider at CERN, ripping holes between dimensions, simulation theory, glitches in the Matrix, the idea that reality itself had been altered and our memories were the only evidence of what things used to be. These explanations are, in a very specific way, comforting, because if reality shifted, then your memory is fine. You remembered correctly. It is the universe that changed around you. Your past is still intact somewhere, in some other timeline, in some other branch of the wave function. The scientific explanation offers no such comfort, and it is significantly worse than any of the paranormal ones, because the science does not say reality shifted. The science says your brain was never recording reality in the first place. There is a question at the center of this, and it is one that neuroscience has been circling for decades without ever fully answering. If your memories are not real, how would you know? Think about that for a second, not as a philosophical abstraction, but as a concrete problem. You have memories. They feel vivid. They feel certain. They come with emotions, with textures, with the absolute conviction that you were there, and this is what happened. But the Monopoly man has never worn a monocle, and you would have sworn otherwise. The Berenstain Bears have always been spelled with an A, and you would have bet money on an E. So what else are you wrong about? What else has your brain constructed from scratch and presented to you as fact with the same unshakable confidence? To understand why the real answer is so disturbing, we need to look at what happens when memory goes catastrophically wrong. Because the people who first mapped the architecture of human memory did it by studying a man who lost his entirely. On September 1st, 1953, a 27-year-old named Henry Molaison lay on an operating table in Hartford, Connecticut, while a neurosurgeon named William Beecher Scoville performed what Scoville himself described as a frankly experimental procedure. Henry suffered from severe epilepsy, possibly from a bicycle accident at age 7, and the seizures had become unmanageable. Scoville's plan was to remove the tissue he believed was responsible. He cut away approximately 8 centimeters of tissue from each side of Henry's medial temporal lobe, including most of both hippocampi, most of both amygdalae, and the entorhinal cortex. Henry was awake for the surgery. At the time, nobody knew what the hippocampus actually did. The seizures got somewhat better, but the cost was devastating. Henry Molaison, known to the world for the next 5 decades only as Patient HM, woke up into a condition from which he would never escape. He could not form new memories. Not of faces, not of facts, not of events. He described it as like waking from a dream. Every day was alone in itself. He could hold a thought for about 30 seconds, and then it was gone. He could carry on a conversation, and 5 minutes later, have no memory it had happened. He met the same researchers hundreds of times over 55 years, and never recognized a single one of them. But here is the thing that turned Henry Molaison into the most studied patient in the history of neuroscience. His intelligence was intact. His personality was intact. His working memory was fine, and he could learn motor skills. A researcher named Brenda Milner, who had earned her PhD from McGill University under the legendary Donald Hebb in 1952, demonstrated something extraordinary. She had Henry practice mirror drawing, a task where you trace a shape while only looking at your hand's reflection. Over 3 days of practice, he got better. His performance improved on a normal learning curve. And each day, when she brought him the task, he had absolutely no memory of ever having done it before. He learned without knowing he had learned. He got better at something he did not remember doing. Milner, who was born in 1918 and is still active at the age of 107, had just proved something that would reshape the entire field. Memory is not one thing. There are different systems stored in different parts of the brain, and the hippocampus is critical for forming new conscious memories, but not for the kind of unconscious skill learning that let Henry improve at mirror drawing. The landmark paper she co-authored with Scoville in 1957 established all of this. Henry Molaison's name now appears in nearly 12,000 journal articles. When he died on December 2nd, 2008, at age 82, his brain was sectioned into 2,401 slices, and the dissection was live-streamed on the internet. He had spent 55 years trapped in a perpetual present, and in doing so, he revealed that memory has an architecture. But knowing that memory has an architecture does not tell you whether that architecture can be trusted. Because while Milner and her colleagues were mapping the brain regions involved in memory, another scientist was spending 3 decades trying to answer a more fundamental question. Where, physically, is a memory stored? Carl Lashley started his search for the engram in the 1920s. The engram, a term coined by a German zoologist named Richard Seaman in 1904, is the physical trace that a memory leaves in the brain. Lashley was convinced that if you could find it, you could find memory itself. So he trained rats to navigate mazes, then surgically removed specific pieces of their cerebral cortex, sometimes with tools as crude as a soldering iron, and tested whether they could still remember the route. He did this for over 30 years, and he found something deeply strange. It did not matter which part of the cortex he removed. The rat's memory loss correlated with how much tissue he took out, not where he took it from. Remove a little from anywhere, and they slowed down slightly. Remove a lot from anywhere, and they struggled significantly, but no specific region seemed to be the place where the memory lived. His 1950 paper, titled In Search of the Engram, summarized decades of failure with a line that became famous in neuroscience. I sometimes feel, in reviewing the evidence on the localization of the memory trace, that the necessary conclusion is that learning just is not possible. He was joking, but only barely. Lashley had spent his career looking for where memories are stored and concluded that they seem to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. He failed because he was looking exclusively in the cerebral cortex and never targeted the subcortical structures, the hippocampus and amygdala, and other regions that Henry Molaison's surgery would soon reveal to be critical. He also did not appreciate that multiple memory systems exist, but his intuition was partly right. Memory is distributed. It lives in networks, not in filing cabinets. The molecular machinery of how memories actually form was finally revealed by a man who came to neuroscience from a very different direction. Eric Kandel was born in Vienna on November 7th, 1929. He was a Jewish child who experienced Kristallnacht, the night of organized violence against Jewish communities across Germany and Austria, and fled the Nazis at age 10. Originally drawn to Freud and psychoanalysis, he ended up studying something far more tangible, the physical basis of memory, using an animal that his colleagues initially thought was absurd, Aplysia californica, a marine sea slug. It has about 20,000 nerve cells, compared to the roughly 86 billion in your brain. Many of those neurons are large enough to see with the naked eye and can be individually identified. Kandel's colleagues were skeptical that studying a slug could tell you anything about human memory. He persisted for decades. What he found earned him the 2000 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. Memory, at its most fundamental level, is a change in the strength of connections between neurons. When you learn something in the short term, existing synapses are temporarily strengthened through chemical changes. Serotonin triggers a cascade through cyclic AMP and protein kinase A that modifies ion channels, increasing the release of the neurotransmitter glutamate. This lasts minutes to hours. No new physical structures are built, but long-term memory is different. Long-term memory requires the construction of entirely new synaptic connections. Protein kinase A and another enzyme called MMAPK travel into the nucleus of the neuron, activate a transcription factor called CREB, which switches on genes that produce new proteins, which build new synaptic terminals. Short-term memory changes the chemistry. Long-term memory changes the anatomy. And these mechanisms, Kandel showed, are conserved across evolution. The same molecular logic that lets a sea slug learn to withdraw its gill in response to a stimulus operates in the neurons of your hippocampus when you memorize a phone number. So now we have the architecture. The hippocampus is critical for forming new, conscious memories. Different memory systems live in different brain regions. Memories are physically encoded in the strength and structure of synaptic connections across distributed networks. The molecular machinery involves gene expression, protein synthesis, and the literal growth of new cellular structures. This is well understood, experimentally verified, and supported by more than half a century of research from Milner through Kandel. But none of this answers our question. Because the question is not, how does memory work? The question is, can you trust it? And the answer to that question begins with a woman who discovered she could not trust her own. Elizabeth Loftus was born on October 16th, 1944, in Los Angeles, on July 10th, 1959. When she was 14 years old, her mother drowned in the family swimming pool. It was the defining trauma of her young life. She went on to study mathematics and psychology at UCLA, earned her PhD from Stanford in 1970 in mathematical psychology, and built what would become the most important body of research on human memory ever assembled. She has published over 600 scientific articles, provided expert testimony in more than 300 court cases, including the trials of Ted Bundy, O.J. Simpson, Harvey Weinstein, the Menendez brothers, Ghislaine Maxwell, and the McMartin preschool case. She was ranked the 58th most eminent psychologist of the 20th century, the highest ranked woman on the list, elected to the National Academy of Sciences, and has spent decades receiving death threats for her work. Armed guards at her lectures, a 21-month university investigation that ultimately exonerated her, lawsuits, harassment, all because of what her research proved about the human mind. But the moment that matters most happened on her 44th birthday in 1988 at a family gathering. Her uncle told her something she had never known. He said that she, Elizabeth, had been the one to find her mother's body in the swimming pool, and as soon as he said it, memories began drifting back. She could see the pool. She could see her mother floating. The images felt vivid and real, the way traumatic memories do. A few days later, her brother called. The uncle had made a mistake. It was Elizabeth's aunt who found the body, not Elizabeth. Those vivid memories of discovering her mother, memories that had arrived with the full emotional weight of truth, were completely false. The world's foremost expert on false memory had just experienced one, about the most traumatic event of her entire life. She wrote later that she was left with a sense of wonder at the inherent credulity of even my skeptical mind. What Loftus did with this insight changed the way we understand the human brain. In 1974, she and John Palmer ran an experiment that sounds almost too simple to be important. They showed 45 students short film clips of car accidents and then asked them to estimate how fast the cars were going. The question was the same each time, with one small difference. They changed a single word. About how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? The average estimate was 40.8 miles per hour. About how fast were the cars going when they contacted each other? The average estimate was 31.8. One word, 9 miles per hour of difference. But the second experiment was the one that mattered. 150 students watched a 1-minute film containing a 4-second car accident. There was no broken glass in the film. A third were asked the speed question using the word smashed. A third were asked using hit. A third were not asked at all. 1 week later, they all came back and were asked, "Did you see any broken glass?" 12% of the control group falsely reported broken glass. 14% of the hit group did. 32% of the smashed group remembered seeing glass that was never there. A single word introduced after the event more than doubled the rate of false memory creation. The word did not just change their interpretation of the event, it changed what they remembered seeing. This was not an isolated result. Loftus and her colleagues went on to show that false memories could be implanted wholesale. The Lost in the Mall study, inspired by an idea from her undergraduate student Jim Cohn, gave 24 participants 4 written stories about their childhood. 3 were real events provided by their families. 1 was entirely fabricated, a story about getting lost in a shopping mall around age 5 and being rescued by an elderly stranger. 25% of participants came to believe the false event had happened. They produced detailed memories of it. They added sensory details the researchers had never mentioned. A 2023 replication with a sample 5 times larger found the rate had risen to 35%. In 2002, researchers showed participants doctored childhood photographs that included a hot air balloon ride that never happened. Half of them developed memories of the ride. In 2015, psychologist Julia Shaw demonstrated that in just 3 40-minute interviews conducted over 3 weeks, 70% of participants developed false memories of committing crimes they had never committed, including theft and assault with a weapon, complete with elaborate multi-sensory details and false recollections of interacting with police. And then there is the DRM paradigm, first proposed by James Dease in 1959 and revived by Henry Roediger and Kathleen McDermott in 1995. This one does not even require external suggestion. You hear a list of related words: bed, rest, awake, tired, dream, wake, snooze, blanket, doze, slumber, snore, nap, peace, yawn, drowsy. The word sleep is never on the list. It ties all the other words together, but it is never spoken. When tested, 40% of people recall hearing sleep in free recall. In recognition tests, the rate climbs to 55 to 80%. And of those who falsely recognize it, 72% do not merely think they heard it. They report vivid, remember experiences. They genuinely believe they heard the word spoken. Your brain generated a memory of an event that never occurred, from purely internal processing, with no outside suggestion at all, and tagged it with the same feeling of vivid recollection that accompanies real memories. And you would never know the difference. This is what the Mandela Effect actually is. It is not a glitch in the matrix. It is not CERN punching holes between dimensions. It is the normal operation of a brain that was never designed to be a recording device. Schemas fill in details that should be there. Gist memory preserves the meaning but drops the specifics. And when the specifics are needed, the brain fabricates them from expectations. Source monitoring fails, and you cannot tell whether you saw the cornucopia on the logo, or in a meme, or in your own imagination. And social contagion spreads the errors, because a study of over 100,000 news stories showed that hoaxes and rumors spread 70% faster than truth. Every time someone shares a meme of the Monopoly man with a monocle, a few more million brains encoded as a real memory. But at this point, maybe physics can offer an escape hatch. Because there is a version of quantum mechanics that says every possible outcome of every event actually happens. And if that is true, then maybe, somewhere, in some other branch of reality, the Berenstain Bears really are spelled with an E. Maybe your memory is not wrong. Maybe you are just remembering the wrong universe. This idea has a name. It has a mathematical framework. It was proposed by a brilliant, troubled physicist whose life and death are so entangled with the theory itself that it is impossible to discuss one without the other. Hugh Everett III was born on November 11th, 1930, in Washington, D.C. His parents divorced when he was about 6. At age 12, he wrote a letter to Albert Einstein asking about the nature of the universe. Einstein wrote back, "There is no such thing like an irresistible force and immovable body," Einstein told him. But there seems to be a very stubborn boy who has forced his way victoriously through strange difficulties created by himself for this purpose. Everett studied chemical engineering at Catholic University, then went to Princeton on a National Science Foundation fellowship in 1953. He first studied game theory under Albert Tucker, writing a paper on recursive games that John Nash considered extraordinary, but he drifted into physics, into the orbit of John Archibald Wheeler, and a drunken conversation with his roommate Charles Misner in 1954 sparked the idea that would define and ultimately ruin his life. The problem Everett tackled was the measurement problem in quantum mechanics. In the Copenhagen interpretation, the standard view at the time, a quantum system exists in a superposition of states until someone measures it, at which point the wave function collapses into one definite outcome. But this raises an obvious question. What counts as a measurement? If quantum mechanics is truly universal, if it applies to everything, then the measuring device is also a quantum system. So is the observer. So is the room. Where does the collapse actually happen and why? Everett's solution was radical and elegant. Drop the collapse entirely. All possible measurement outcomes actually occur. The universe does not choose one result and discard the rest. Instead, every possible outcome is realized in what Everett called relative states. If a particle can go left or right, it goes both. The observer who sees it go left, and the observer who sees it go right. Both exist, but in separate branches of the wave function that can no longer interact with each other. Bryce DeWitt would later name this the many worlds interpretation in a 1970 Physics Today article. The reception was catastrophic. Wheeler traveled to Copenhagen in May of 1956 to secure a favorable response from Niels Bohr. He failed completely. When Everett himself visited in the spring of 1959, at Wheeler's urging, it was worse. Leon Rosenfeld, Bohr's longtime collaborator, said of Everett that he was undescribably stupid and could not understand the simplest things in quantum mechanics. Everett described the visit as a hell doomed from the beginning. The physics community's response was, in his word, overwhelmingly negative. Everett never returned to academic physics. He was already working at the Pentagon's Weapons Systems Evaluation Group, and he threw himself into that career instead. He rose to direct its Department of Physical and Mathematical Sciences. He led the team that programmed the SIOP computers, the machines that would have coordinated the launch of America's nuclear arsenal. He co-founded Lambda Corporation in 1964 and DBS Corporation in 1973. He was brilliant, wealthy, and by all accounts emotionally absent from the people closest to him. A colleague described him as bringing a cold, brutal logic to the study of things. To his children, he was a lump of furniture sitting at the dining room table, always with a cigarette, jotting down notations. He chain-smoked 3 packs a day. He drank heavily. He became grossly overweight. He never exercised. He never saw a doctor. And he was known to discuss with colleagues a concept called quantum immortality. The idea derived from his own theory that consciousness would always continue in whichever branch of the wave function where the observer survives. If many worlds is true, there is always a branch where you do not die. From your own subjective perspective, you are immortal. His daughter Elizabeth made her first suicide attempt in June of 1982. When his son Mark found her and got her to a hospital, Everett looked up from his newspaper and said, "I didn't know she was that sad." On the night of July 18th or 19th, 1982, Hugh Everett III died of a heart attack in his bed in McLean, Virginia. He was 51 years old and legally drunk. His 19-year-old son, Mark, found the body the next morning. Mark later said he had no real relationship with his father and realized, standing over the body, that he had no memory of ever physically touching him. Everett was a committed atheist. He had asked that his remains be disposed of in the trash. His wife Nancy kept the ashes briefly, then complied with his wishes. Elizabeth Everett committed suicide in 1996. She was 39 years old. In her note, she asked that her ashes be thrown in the garbage, like her father's. She wrote, "Please sprinkle me in some nice body of water or the garbage. Maybe that way I'll end up in the correct parallel universe to meet up with Daddy." Mark Oliver Everett became the lead singer of the rock band Eels. He was unaware of his father's scientific significance until after Hugh's death. A 2007 BBC documentary, Parallel Worlds, Parallel Lives, follows Mark retracing his father's career. He said his father was, in his own parallel universe, deeply disappointed that the world did not recognize his genius. The rehabilitation came too late for Everett to see it. DeWitt's 1970 article renewed interest. A 1973 anthology featuring Everett's unpublished long thesis sold out. Advances in Quantum Decoherence Theory by Wojciech Zurek in 1981 gave the framework physical grounding. David Deutsch at Oxford became its most prominent champion. Today, many worlds is one of the leading interpretations of quantum mechanics. Meanwhile, Wheeler, who had initially championed Everett's theory, publicly disavowed it in 1980. He later sent a letter commemorating Everett's 1957 paper. It arrived a year and a half after Everett was dead. So the theory is real. The mathematics is sound. Parallel branches of the wave function, each containing a version of every possible outcome, are a legitimate interpretation of quantum mechanics defended by serious physicists at serious institutions. But the theory does not say what Mandela Effect believers want it to say, and the reasons it fails are not subtle. Many worlds explicitly forbids information transfer between branches. Once decoherence separates two outcomes, they cannot communicate. There is no mechanism for a memory to leak from one branch to another. This would violate not just the interpretation itself, but basic conservation laws. It is not a technicality. It is the entire point. The branches are separate precisely because they cannot interact. Decoherence, the process that makes quantum effects invisible at human scales, operates on timescales so fast they are almost meaningless. Femtoseconds, quadrillionths of a second. Human brains are warm, wet, electrically noisy systems in constant interaction with their environment. Maintaining quantum coherence in a brain long enough for any kind of cross-branch communication would require conditions that do not exist in biological tissue. A calculation by physicist Max Tegmark showed that for a 10-kilogram object to become quantum mechanically delocalized by just 1 micrometer would take approximately 3 quadrillion years. That is roughly 200,000 times the current age of the universe. Branching only goes forward. The past does not unbranch. Branches do not merge. There is no mechanism in many worlds for two separate histories to collide and produce conflicting memories in the same brain. Astrophysicist Ethan Siegel put it bluntly. "You do have a faulty memory," he wrote, "and parallel universes aren't the reason." CERN particle physicist Clara Nellist, debunking the conspiracy theories on TikTok, was even more direct. "Look, just because you misremembered something does not mean CERN is going around changing your Oreos. There is not a single peer-reviewed physics paper that links the Mandela Effect to quantum mechanics. Not one. The CERN conspiracy theories themselves are easy to address. The Large Hadron Collider, the largest particle accelerator on Earth, produces collisions at energies of about 13 trillion electron volts. Cosmic rays hitting Earth's atmosphere produce collisions at energies millions of times higher, and they have been doing so for billions of years without ripping any holes in anything. If high-energy particle collisions could shift you between timelines, the cosmos would have been doing it since before the Earth existed. Simulation theory, the idea proposed by philosopher Nick Bostrom in 2003, that we might be living in a computer simulation and the Mandela Effect represents glitches, is not even wrong in the scientific sense. Bostrom himself assigns the hypothesis less than 50% probability, perhaps around 20%, and noted that apparent glitches could just be frailties of our mind. The argument is unfalsifiable. It makes no specific predictions about memory errors. It is philosophy dressed as physics. So physics cannot save your memories. The parallel universes are real in the mathematics, but they are walled off from each other by the deepest laws of quantum mechanics. CERN cannot punch holes between them. Simulation theory cannot explain why you specifically remember a cornucopia that never existed. Every physics-based explanation for the Mandela Effect fails, not on a technicality, but on fundamentals. Which means the answer really is your brain, and the answer your brain gives, when you follow the science all the way down, is not just that memory is imperfect. That would be manageable. Everybody knows memory is imperfect. You forget where you put your keys. You get names wrong at parties. That is imperfect memory, and you can live with it because you assume the important stuff, the memories that define who you are, the ones you have revisited 1,000 times, the ones that feel absolutely certain. Those are solid. They are not. And the reason they are not is the single most disturbing discovery in the modern science of memory. a discovery that was first made in 1968, ignored for 30 years, and then confirmed in a way that overturned a century of scientific dogma. The discovery is this: every time you remember something, you risk destroying it. In 1968, 3 researchers named Misanin, Miller, and Lewis published a short paper in Science that should have changed everything. They had trained rats to fear a tone by pairing it with an electric shock, standard fear conditioning, the kind of experiment that had been done thousands of times. The twist was what they did the next day, 24 hours after training, when the fear memory should have been fully consolidated, meaning stabilized, fixed, permanent. They briefly re-exposed the rats to the tone, just long enough to reactivate the memory. Then they hit them with electroconvulsive shock. The fear memory was destroyed, not weakened, destroyed. The rats that had been terrified of the tone the day before now showed no fear response at all. But here is the critical detail. Rats that received the electroconvulsive shock without first hearing the tone, without reactivating the memory, retained their fear perfectly. The shock alone did nothing. The memory had to be active, had to be in the process of being remembered for it to become vulnerable. The implication was staggering. Consolidated memories, the kind that were supposed to be permanent, were not permanent at all. They became fragile again the moment you accessed them. The act of remembering opened a window during which the memory could be altered or erased entirely. The paper's key finding, stated plainly, was that the determining factor in whether a memory could be disrupted was not how old it was, but what state it was in at the moment of disruption. This should have been one of the most important discoveries in neuroscience. It was largely ignored for 30 years. The finding was so far outside the accepted model of memory, the idea that consolidation was a one-time event that produced a permanent trace, that the field essentially could not process it. It sat in the literature, cited occasionally, never seriously pursued. Then Karim Nader showed up. Nader had earned his PhD from the University of Toronto in 1996 and was working as a postdoctoral researcher in Joseph Ledoux's lab at New York University. Ledoux was one of the leading researchers on the neuroscience of fear, and his lab was focused on the amygdala, the brain region central to emotional memory. Nader had been thinking about reconsolidation, the idea that memories might need to be restabilized every time they were accessed, and he wanted to test it with the molecular tools that had not existed in 1968. When he proposed the experiments to Ledoux, the response was not encouraging. Ledoux told Nader, in what Nader later described as no uncertain terms, that he thought the idea was a waste of time and money. Nader did the experiment anyway. The design was clean and devastating. Rats were fear-conditioned to associate a tone with a foot shock. One day later, the fear memory was reactivated by playing the tone. The rats froze, confirming they remembered. Immediately after reactivation, Nader infused anisomycin, a protein synthesis inhibitor, directly into the lateral and basal nuclei of the amygdala. The dose was 62.5 micrograms per side, delivered through surgically implanted cannulae. The results, published in Nature in August of 2000, were unambiguous. Rats showed intact short-term memory for about 4 hours after treatment, but at 24 hours, the fear memory was gone. The rats showed no fear response to the tone. The memory had been erased. The controls told the rest of the story. Anisomycin without reactivation had no effect. The memory had to be active. Anisomycin delayed by 6 hours after reactivation had no effect. The window had closed, and even memories that were 14 days old, well past the traditional consolidation period, could be disrupted when reactivated. What Nader had proved was that the 1968 finding was real, and the mechanism was protein synthesis. When you recall a memory, it does not simply play back like a video. The memory is physically destabilized. The synaptic connections that encode it become labile, unfixed, and must be rebuilt from scratch using newly synthesized proteins. This process, reconsolidation, is not optional. If the new proteins are not made, the memory degrades or disappears. Every single act of remembering is an act of reconstruction. The reaction from the scientific establishment was intense. At conferences, senior researchers told Nader things like, "Your data is very strong, but I just can't believe it." The younger generation was more receptive. By the 2020s, reconsolidation has been demonstrated across fruit flies, sea slugs, chickens, rats, mice, and humans. It is mainstream science. Nader is now the James McGill Professor at McGill University in Montreal. But consider what this means for the question we started with. Every memory you have, every important memory, every memory you are certain about, has been reconsolidated, probably many times. Every time you recalled your wedding, every time you told the story of how you met your partner, every time you revisited a childhood memory, you pulled it out of storage, held it in a labile state, and rebuilt it. And each rebuild is an opportunity for alteration. The post-event information Loftus studied, a misleading word, a suggestion from a friend, a photograph, a news report, can be incorporated during reconsolidation. The schemas and gist traces that cognitive psychology identified. The monkey should have a tail expectation. The wealthy man should have a monocle assumption, can overwrite the original details during reconsolidation. The social contagion that spreads through shared conversations and internet memes can become part of the memory during reconsolidation. And here is the part that truly twists the knife. The memories you recall most often, the ones you consider the most important, the ones you would say define who you are, those are the memories that have been reconsolidated the most times. They have been through the most rebuilds. They have had the most opportunities for drift, distortion, and fabrication. The memories you feel most certain about are, in a very real neurobiological sense, the ones you should trust the least. This is not a theoretical concern. A researcher named Daniela Schiller turned it into one of the most striking findings in modern neuroscience, and she did it because of a silence she grew up with. Schiller was born on October 26, 1972, in Rishon LeZion, Israel. Her father, Sigmund Schiller, was a Holocaust survivor. He never spoke about what happened to him. In Israel, where the Holocaust was commemorated publicly and discussed in schools, Schiller grew up with what she described as a wall between the national memory of the event and her father's profound personal silence. She could see the effects of trauma in him, but the memories themselves were locked away. This gap between the visible damage and the hidden experience drew her to study whether emotional memories could be changed. In 2010, she and her colleagues published a paper in Nature that demonstrated the first non-invasive, drug-free method for disrupting fear memories in humans. The protocol exploited the reconsolidation window directly. Participants were fear-conditioned. The next day, the fear memory was reactivated. Then, within 10 minutes of reactivation, while the memory was still in its labile state, extinction training was conducted. Standard fear extinction. The repeated presentation of the stimulus without the feared outcome. If the extinction training happened within the reconsolidation window, the fear response was eliminated, not suppressed, eliminated. There was no spontaneous recovery, no reinstatement. The effects lasted at least a year. If the extinction training happened outside the window, more than 6 hours after reactivation, the fear returned, as it does with standard extinction therapy. What Schiller had shown was that the reconsolidation window is not just a vulnerability. It is a therapeutic opportunity. If you can catch a memory while it is being rebuilt, you can change what gets rebuilt. You can write new information into the memory trace before it restabilizes. The traumatic memory is not erased. The person still knows what happened. But the emotional charge, the terror, the visceral response can be stripped away. Schiller also plays drums in a band called the Amygdaloids with Joseph Ledoux. She told her story at a Moth storytelling event. A 2016 documentary called Reconsolidation follows her return to Israel to hear her father's memories for the first time. The personal and the scientific are, in her work, inseparable. Meanwhile, at McGill University, a colleague named Alain Brunet was translating reconsolidation into clinical treatment using a different approach. Propranolol, a common beta blocker, administered 90 minutes before a 25-minute trauma reactivation session, once weekly for 6 weeks. Open-label trials showed PTSD diagnosis rates dropping by 71 to 86%. Symptom severity fell by 50 to 56%. At the University of Amsterdam, Merrill Kint demonstrated something even more striking. 40 milligrams of propranolol eliminated the emotional expression of a fear memory while leaving the declarative memory intact. People remembered what happened. They just were not afraid of it anymore. The results are not entirely clean. Some replication attempts have failed. A 2015 study by Wood and colleagues found propranolol did not reduce PTSD symptoms. In 3 psychophysiological studies, a 2021 study by Roulet found no significant difference between propranolol and placebo groups. The clinical translation remains a work in progress, but the principle is established. Memories are not fixed objects. They are rebuilt every time they are accessed, and the rebuilding process can be hijacked by a drug, by a suggestion, by a misleading word in a question, by a meme on the internet, by a conversation with a friend who remembers things differently. The question is not whether your memories have been altered. The question is, how much? And the brain will never tell you, because the brain does not have a mechanism for distinguishing its own fabrications from reality. This is not hyperbole. In the 1970s, Michael Gazzaniga and Joseph Ledoux were studying split brain patients at Caltech, people whose corpus callosum, the bundle of nerve fibers connecting the 2 hemispheres, had been surgically severed to treat epilepsy. Roger Sperry would win the Nobel Prize for this work in 1981. What Gazzaniga discovered about confabulation was perhaps more disturbing than anything in the split brain research itself. In one experiment, a split-brain patient's left hemisphere was shown a picture of a chicken claw. His right hemisphere, simultaneously and independently, was shown a picture of a snow scene. Each hemisphere could only see its own image. When asked to point to related objects, his right hand, controlled by the left hemisphere, pointed to a chicken. His left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, pointed to a snow shovel. So far, so logical. Then they asked him why, and the left hemisphere, the one with language, the one that had seen the chicken claw but had zero access to the snow scene, instantly produced an explanation. "Oh, that's easy," the patient said. "The chicken claw goes with the chicken, and you need a shovel to clean out the chicken shed." He was not lying. He was not guessing. He genuinely believed his explanation. The left hemisphere, confronted with a behavior it could not actually explain because the real reason existed in the other hemisphere, which it could not communicate with, fabricated a perfectly plausible story and delivered it with total confidence. Gazzaniga called this the left brain interpreter and described it as a module that creates a running narrative of our experience. "We wake up," he wrote. "We add to it. We forget parts of it. And when we forget parts, we make up other stuff. That's why we're full of false memories. This is not something that only happens to split-brain patients." In 1977, Nisbet and Wilson ran an experiment where shoppers chose the best quality pair from 4 identical pairs of stockings. There was a strong position effect. People overwhelmingly chose whichever pair was on the right. When asked why they chose that pair, nobody said, "I picked the ones on the right." They confabulated. The color was better. The fabric felt nicer. The weave was tighter. All fabricated explanations for a decision that was driven by nothing more than position. In 2005, a team in Sweden showed people 2 photographs and asked which face they found more attractive. Using sleight of hand, the researchers swapped the chosen photo for the unchosen one. The majority of participants did not notice, and when asked to explain their choice, they confidently described features of the face they had not chosen, attributing qualities to it that they themselves had rejected moments earlier. The philosopher Jonathan Haidt described this situation perfectly. "The conscious mind thinks it is the Oval Office," he wrote, "when in reality it is the press office. Your brain is not in charge of what it does. It is in charge of explaining what it did after the fact in a way that feels coherent, and it will fabricate whatever it needs to make the story work." So where does this leave us? The Mandela Effect is not a mystery. It is a symptom. Every cognitive mechanism that produces shared false memories has been identified, experimentally validated, and replicated across decades of research. Schemas fill in what should be there. Gist memory preserves meaning but loses specifics. Source monitoring fails to track where information came from. Social contagion spreads errors through networks. Confabulation papers over the gaps, and reconsolidation means that every time you access a memory, you rebuild it from components, and each rebuild is an opportunity for all of these distortions to be incorporated as if they were the original. The Mandela Effect is what happens when millions of brains independently run the same faulty reconstruction. The Monopoly man should have a monocle because wealthy gentlemen have monocles. Curious George should have a tail because monkeys have tails. The Berenstain Bears should be spelled with an E because that is how similar names typically end in English. These are not random errors. They are the predictable output of a system that prioritizes plausibility over accuracy. But the real question, the one that should keep you up at night, is not about logos and movie quotes. It is about everything else. If your brain can fabricate a cornucopia with perfect confidence, if it can make you remember broken glass that was never there, if it can construct detailed memories of crimes you never committed, then what is it doing with the memories that actually matter? The ones you build your identity around, the ones you use to explain who you are and why. Because every one of those memories has been reconsolidated. Every one of them has been rebuilt, probably dozens of times. And each rebuild happened in a different context, with different emotions, different knowledge, different motivations. The wedding you remember is not the wedding that happened. It is the wedding your brain has reconstructed across years of retelling, influenced by everything that has happened since, shaped by who you have become, edited to fit the story you tell yourself about your life. And the brain that did all of this editing will never flag a single change. It will present the reconstructed version with exactly the same conviction it would present an accurate one. You have no internal mechanism for telling the difference. If your memories are not real, how would you know? The Mandela Effect says you would not. Millions of people remember a cornucopia that never existed with certainty, with consistency, with the same wrong details. They are not stupid. They are not careless. They are human. And their brains are doing exactly what human brains do. The question is what that means for the rest of your memories. And the answer to that question leads somewhere darker than any parallel universe. On a night in 1984, in Burlington, North Carolina, a 22-year-old college student named Jennifer Thompson was raped at knife point in her apartment. During the attack, she made a decision that she would later describe as deliberate and conscious. She studied her attacker's face. She looked at his hairline, his nose, his eyebrows, his skin. She told herself that if she survived, she was going to make sure this man was caught. She was going to be the best witness the police had ever had. When detectives showed her a photo lineup, she identified a man named Ronald Cotton. When they brought her to a physical lineup, she identified him again. In court, she testified with what she described as 100% certainty. Ronald Cotton was convicted on January 17, 1985, and sentenced to life plus 50 years in prison. He was 22 years old. At his retrial in 1987, something strange happened. The actual rapist, a man named Bobby Poole, was by then incarcerated in the same prison as Cotton. Poole resembled Cotton closely enough that they were frequently mistaken for one another. Poole had even admitted to other inmates that he committed the rape. When Poole was brought into the courtroom, Jennifer Thompson looked at him and said she had never seen him before in her life. Cotton was convicted again, 2 life sentences. On June 30th, 1995, DNA testing proved that Ronald Cotton was innocent. Bobby Poole was the rapist. Cotton had spent 10.5 years in prison for a crime committed by a man who had been sitting in the same facility, lifting weights in the same gym, walking the same corridors. Cotton received $110,000 in compensation and got a job at LabCorp, the company whose DNA testing had proved his innocence. Jennifer Thompson's memory had not been vague or uncertain. It had been vivid, detailed, and delivered with absolute confidence. She had deliberately studied her attacker's face during the assault, specifically to ensure an accurate identification. And every detail she remembered was wrong, not because she was careless, because her brain did exactly what brains do. It reconstructed, and the reconstruction was confident, consistent, and false. Thompson and Cotton later became friends. They co-authored a book called Picking Cotton in 2009. Thompson became an advocate for eyewitness identification reform. She now speaks publicly about how the criminal justice system places devastating faith in a cognitive process that the science has thoroughly discredited. Cotton's case is not unusual. Kirk Bloodsworth holds a distinction that no one would want. He was the first American sentenced to death and subsequently exonerated by DNA evidence. In 1984, 5 eyewitnesses testified they saw Bloodsworth near the scene of 9-year-old Dawn Hamilton's murder. He was convicted on March 8, 1985, and sentenced to death. He spent 2 years on death row and another 6 years and 10 months in prison before reading about a new technology called DNA fingerprinting. He requested testing. On June 28, 1993, after 8 years, 10 months, and 19 days of incarceration, he was released. In 2003, the DNA was matched to a man named Kimberly Shea Ruffner, who'd been incarcerated 1 floor below Bloodsworth in the same prison. They had lifted weights together. The Kirk Bloodsworth post-conviction DNA testing program, part of the Innocence Protection Act of 2004, now provides $10 million per year in federal grants for post-conviction testing. These are not isolated cases. The Innocence Project, founded in 1992 by Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld, has achieved 254 exonerations as of September 2025. Collectively, those innocent people served 4,045 years in prison. The average was nearly 16 years per person. 58% of the exonerees are Black. The average age at wrongful conviction was 27, and in 69% of those 367 DNA exonerations, the leading factor was eyewitness misidentification. Think about those numbers for a second. 4,045 years. That is roughly the span of time from the construction of the Great Pyramid to the present day. That much human life was taken away based on memories that felt certain, that were delivered with confidence, that juries found credible, and that were wrong. And here is what makes it worse. Brandon Garrett, a legal scholar who analyzed 161 eyewitness misidentification cases that led to DNA exonerations, found that more than half of the witnesses had been initially uncertain but expressed confidence at trial. Their certainty had inflated over time through repeated questioning, through the confirmation of being told they picked the right person, through the social pressure of the courtroom. A single comment from a lineup administrator, something as simple as, "We thought it was that one," can inflate an uncertain witness into a certain one, and that inflation is permanent. The witness does not experience it as external pressure. They experience it as their memory becoming clearer. A meta-analysis by Cutler and Penrod in 1989 found that a witness's confidence before making an identification has no correlation with accuracy. None. The most confident witnesses are no more likely to be right than the least confident ones. And yet, the Supreme Court's criteria for evaluating eyewitness reliability, established in Neal versus Biggers in 1972, include the level of certainty demonstrated at the confrontation as a factor. This standard was not based on empirical evidence. It has not been revisited since 1977. 50 years of memory science has happened since then, and the legal standard still treats confidence as a proxy for accuracy. 89 actual perpetrators have been identified through Innocence Project exonerations. Those perpetrators committed 101 additional violent crimes, while the innocent persons sat in prison, including 56 sexual assaults and 22 murders. Every one of those crimes happened because a confident eyewitness pointed at the wrong person, and the system believed them. This is where the science of false memory stops being an academic curiosity and becomes something that costs human lives. The same cognitive machinery that makes you remember a cornucopia on the fruit of the Loom logo. The same reconstruction process, the same schema-driven gap-filling, the same confidence in fabricated details operates when a traumatized victim looks at a lineup and identifies the wrong face. The mechanisms are identical. The consequences are separated by everything, and the criminal justice system is only the beginning. Because the question of whether you can trust your memories does not stop at courtroom doors. It extends into your therapist's office, your family relationships, your sense of who you are, and eventually into the deepest philosophical question humans have ever asked about themselves. If memory is reconstruction, if every act of remembering is an act of partial creation, then what exactly is the self? What is the thing that persists from one day to the next, the thing you call I? If the thread connecting your present to your past is woven from material that your brain is quietly replacing every time you look at it? The answer to that question is where we are going next. And it is, if you can believe it, even more unsettling than what we have covered so far. In the 1980s and early 90s, something happened in therapists' offices across America that reads, in hindsight, like a controlled experiment in the manufacturing of false memories. Except nobody was controlling it, nobody was measuring it, and the consequences destroyed lives on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. It started with a theory. The theory held that traumatic memories, particularly memories of childhood sexual abuse, could be so painful that the mind buries them, locks them away in a place where the conscious mind cannot access them, a process called repression. The idea traced loosely back to Freud, though Freud's own views on it were complicated and changed over his career. In clinical practice, the theory took a specific form. Patients who presented with depression, anxiety, eating disorders, or relationship problems were told that these symptoms might be caused by repressed memories of childhood abuse. The memories were there, the theory said. They just needed to be recovered. The techniques used to recover them included hypnosis, guided imagery, age regression, journaling exercises, and group therapy in which other patients shared their own recovered memories. A book called The Courage to Heal, published in 1988, told readers, if you think you were abused and your life shows the symptoms, then you were. Another, Michelle remembers, published in 1980, described a woman's recovered memories of satanic ritual abuse so elaborate they included cages, surgical procedures, and demonic summoning. Thousands of patients, under the guidance of well-meaning therapists using these techniques, recovered detailed memories of horrific childhood abuse. Many of them went to law enforcement. Families were ripped apart. Parents were arrested and convicted on the testimony of adult children who had entered therapy for ordinary problems and emerged with vivid recollections of events that, in many cases, had never happened. The scale was enormous. By 1998, the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, founded in March of 1992 by Pamela and Peter Fried, had documented over 1,800 repressed memory lawsuits. The satanic ritual abuse panic, which reached its peak in the late 80s and early 90s, generated hundreds of additional claims. FBI Special Agent Ken Lanning, who was tasked with investigating these allegations, examined hundreds of cases and found no compelling evidence that organized satanic cults engaged in systematic child abuse existed. There were no bodies, no crime scenes, no physical evidence of any kind. There were only memories recovered in therapy that felt absolutely real to the people who held them. The Ramona versus Isabella case in 1994 exposed the mechanism. A California jury awarded $500,000 to Gary Ramona, whose daughter's therapists had used sodium amytal, a barbiturate sometimes called truth serum, to help her recover memories of her father sexually abusing her as a child. The jury found that the therapists had implanted the memories. The daughter's life had been shaped by recollections of events that a court determined had never occurred. By the late 90s, the recovered memory movement was collapsing. Trauma clinics that specialized in memory recovery shut down. Professional organizations issued guidelines warning against suggestive techniques. Clinical psychologist Richard McNally, who spent years reviewing the evidence, called the notion of repressed memory the most pernicious bit of folklore ever to infect psychology and psychiatry. And Loftus was at the center of all of it. Her research on false memory implantation, the same research that would later illuminate the Mandela Effect, made her the most important and most hated witness in the memory wars. She testified for the defense in cases where she believed recovered memories had been manufactured by therapy. She published The Myth of Repressed Memory in 1994. She received death threats. She was followed. She had protesters at her lectures. A woman who claimed Loftus had revealed her identity in a published case study known as the Jane Doe case sued her. 20 of the 21 claims were eventually dismissed. Loftus endured all of this because her research had demonstrated, with experimental precision, exactly what the recovered memory therapists were doing to their patients. The Lost in the Mall study showed that 25% of people could be made to believe a fabricated childhood event. Julia Shaw showed that 70% could be made to believe they had committed crimes. The therapeutic setting, with its authority figures, its repeated sessions, its emotional vulnerability, its guided imagery and hypnosis, was a perfect engine for false memory creation. The therapists were not lying. The patients were not lying. Everyone involved believed the memories were real, and in many cases, they were not. This is the same machinery that produces the Mandela Effect, operating in a different context, at a different scale. The internet is not a therapist's office, but it functions as one, A meme suggesting the Monopoly man wears a monocle serves the same role as a leading question in therapy. Your brain encounters the suggestion, and if the suggestion is schema consistent, if it fits what you expect to be true, the suggestion can be incorporated into your memory during the next reconsolidation. You do not experience this as, "I saw a meme and it changed what I remember." You experience it as, "I have always remembered this." The process is invisible to the person it is happening to, but the memory wars of the 90s, as devastating as they were, pointed towards something that is arguably the most disturbing implication of all. Not just that memories can be false, but that the self is built on them. In 1689, John Locke published an essay concerning human understanding, which contained a claim about personal identity that has shaped how human beings think about themselves ever since. Locke argued that personal identity depends on consciousness, not on substance. What makes you the same person you were yesterday is not that you have the same body, not that you occupy the same physical space, but that you have a continuous thread of memory connecting your present experience to your past. Memory is the substance of the self. It is the thing that makes you you. This was not just a philosophical abstraction. It became the foundation for legal concepts of responsibility, for moral concepts of accountability, for the everyday intuition that there is a you that persists across time. You are the same person who graduated from college, who got married, who held your child for the first time, because you remember those events, and those memories form a continuous chain connecting the person you are now to the person you were then. Neuroscience has spent the last 50 years quietly dismantling this foundation. If memory is reconstructive, if every act of remembering is partly an act of creation, then the chain Locke described is not a solid thread. It is being rewoven every time you touch it. The you of today is connected to the you of 10 years ago by memories that have been reconsolidated dozens of times, influenced by everything that happened in between, shaped by your current emotions and beliefs and motivations, and altered in ways that your brain does not track and cannot report. The philosopher Derek Parfit, in his 1984 book, Reasons and Persons, followed this logic to its conclusion. He argued that personal identity is not a deep metaphysical fact. It is a pattern of psychological continuity, overlapping chains of memory and personality, and that persons are nothing over and above their mental and physical states and their relations. The self is not an entity that possesses memories. The self is the pattern that the memories create. And if the memories change, the pattern changes. And if the pattern changes, the self changes. David Hume had said something similar 200 years earlier. He denied the existence of a persisting self, calling identity nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity. There is no observer behind the perceptions. There is no stage behind the theatre. The bundle is all there is. The ship of Theseus, the ancient thought experiment about whether a ship remains the same ship if you replace every plank, becomes unavoidable here. Your body replaces most of its cells over time. The atoms in your bones, your blood, your skin are not the same atoms that were there a decade ago. The one thing you might have pointed to as the thread of continuity, the thing that stays the same while the body changes, is memory. But memory does not stay the same. Every recall is a reconstruction. Every reconstruction introduces change. The thread you are relying on to maintain your identity is itself being replaced, plank by plank, every time you use it. This is not a theoretical problem. It becomes viscerally, painfully real in the context of Alzheimer's disease. 7.2 million Americans over the age of 65 are currently living with Alzheimer's. That is 1 in 9 people over 65. It is the 7th leading cause of death in the United States. The hippocampus and entorhinal cortex, the very structures Henry Molaison lost in 1953, the structures that are critical for forming new memories and that Brenda Milner spent her career studying, are among the earliest and most severely affected by the disease. Brain changes begin an estimated 20 or more years before the first symptoms appear. The projected cost in the United States alone is $384 billion in 2025, rising to roughly $1 trillion by 2050. Globally, more than 55 million people live with dementia. Alzheimer's takes the philosophical question and makes it a daily reality for millions of families. When a person can no longer remember their spouse's name, when they do not recognize their own children, when the memories that connected them to their life story are gone, is the person still there? The question is not rhetorical. Caregivers and family members live with it every day. They watch someone they love lose the thread of continuity that Locke said defines personhood, and they make their own judgments about what remains. The answer most people give, intuitively and emotionally, is yes. The person is still there. Something persists even when memory does not. But if that is true, then Locke was wrong, and memory is not the foundation of the self. And if Locke was wrong, then the Mandela Effect and everything it reveals about the fragility of memory is not an attack on your identity. It is a revelation that your identity was never built on the foundation you thought it was. But there is another way to read this, and it is the reading that keeps the question open. Maybe Locke was not entirely wrong. Maybe memory is the foundation, and the foundation is exactly as unstable as the science says it is, and the self really is as provisional and reconstructed and unreliable as a cornucopia on a logo that never had one. Maybe the person you think you are is a story your brain tells, updated and edited with every retelling, and there is no final version, no authoritative text, no master copy stored anywhere that you could check against. This is where the science gets genuinely existential, because the Mandela Effect, in the end, is not about the Berenstain Bears or Curious George's tale or the Monopoly Man's monocle. Those are trivial. They are amusing. They make for good internet arguments. But they are symptoms of something much larger, which is that the human brain is a storytelling device that has no commitment to truth. It is committed to coherence, to plausibility, to producing a narrative that lets you navigate the world effectively. And it turns out that accuracy and effectiveness are not the same thing. Your brain will sacrifice accuracy for coherence every single time, because a coherent full story is more useful for survival than an accurate jumble of disconnected fragments. Frederick Bartlett figured this out in 1932 when he asked his undergraduates at Cambridge to recall a Native American folktale called The War of the Ghosts. Over repeated retellings, some stretching out to 10 years, the story got shorter. It went from roughly 330 words to 180. It became more coherent. Supernatural elements were dropped. Canoes became boats. Ghosts disappeared from a story literally called The War of the Ghosts. His subjects were not being careless. They were being human. Their brains were doing what brains do, which is take messy, foreign, contradictory raw material and turn it into a story that makes sense within their own framework. Bartlett called remembering an imaginative reconstruction, not a playback, not a retrieval, an imaginative reconstruction. And every time you remember, you are not accessing a file. You are writing a new draft. The Mandela Effect caught the world's attention because it made this invisible process visible. When millions of people remember the same thing wrong, in the same way, with the same details, it becomes impossible to dismiss as individual error. It becomes a pattern, and patterns demand explanations. The paranormal explanations are satisfying because they preserve the assumption that memory is reliable. Parallel universes, CERN, simulation glitches. These explanations say the problem is out there, in reality itself, not in here, in the thing you use to know what reality is. The neuroscience says the problem has always been in here, and it says the problem is not a bug. It is a feature. Your brain was not designed to record. It was designed to predict. It runs on roughly 20 watts of power, about the same as a dim light bulb, and it manages 86 billion neurons connected by somewhere between 100 and 150 trillion synapses, at least 1,000 times the number of stars in our galaxy. It processes information at speeds ranging from 1 mile per hour in its slowest unmyelinated fibers to 268 miles per hour in its fastest ones. And it does all of this while simultaneously keeping you breathing, pumping your blood, regulating your temperature, tracking your position in space, and constructing a continuous conscious experience from fragmentary sensory data arriving through imperfect organs. Given those constraints, the brain made a design choice. It chose speed and efficiency over accuracy. It chose stories over records. It stores the gist, the meaning, the emotional core, and when details are needed, it fills them in from expectation. Hermann Ebbinghaus, who ran the first experimental studies of forgetting on himself in the 1880s, found that within 1 hour, roughly 50% of newly learned material is lost. Within 1 day, 70%. Within a week, 90%. The brain is shedding details constantly, relentlessly, from the moment they arrive. What remains is not a recording. It is a sketch, and the next time you need it, the brain will fill in the sketch with whatever it has on hand. Schemas, expectations, things other people have told you, things you have seen in memes, things you imagined, things you dreamed. And it will present the result as memory, with confidence, with vivid detail, with the absolute felt sense of truth. And you will believe it because you have no other option. You have no mechanism for checking the original against the reconstruction. The original is gone. It was probably gone within hours. All you have is the latest draft. And the latest draft is the one your brain just wrote. Karim Nader, the man who proved that remembering destabilizes memories, once described it this way. He said that your memory of an event is only as reliable as the last time you remembered it, not the event itself, the last recall. Because the last recall is when the memory was most recently rebuilt, and whatever was in the environment during that rebuild, whatever mood you were in, whatever you had read or heard or believed, had the opportunity to be incorporated. This means the memories you are most confident about, the ones you revisit and retell and cherish, are the most extensively edited. Your wedding day has been reconsolidated through every anniversary, every retelling, every argument about what happened, every photograph that replaced the actual visual memory with an image of a photograph. Your childhood has been reconsolidated through every family gathering where stories were told and details were corrected or embellished or invented. Your sense of who you are has been reconsolidated through every late-night conversation about your past, every therapy session, every moment of self-reflection. You are, right now, a story, and the story is being rewritten every time you read it. There is a version of this that is terrifying, and there is a version that is something else entirely. The terrifying version is the one we have been building toward for the last 45 minutes. Your memories are unreliable. Your identity is constructed from unreliable material. The criminal justice system imprisons innocent people based on the sincere testimony of witnesses whose brains fabricated the details. Therapists in the 1990s manufactured horrific memories in vulnerable patients. Elizabeth Loftus, the woman who spent her life studying all of this, experienced a false memory about the most traumatic event of her own life. And the Mandela Effect, the thing that started as an internet curiosity, turns out to be a window into the fundamental nature of human cognition, a nature that is far less trustworthy than anyone would like to believe. But there is another version, and it comes from a woman whose father survived the Holocaust and never spoke about it, who grew up in a country haunted by memory, who discovered that the reconsolidation window is not just a vulnerability, but a doorway. Daniela Schiller showed that fear memories can be rewritten during reconsolidation. Alain Brunet showed that propranolol can strip the terror from trauma without erasing the knowledge of what happened. Merrill Kint showed that a single dose can eliminate a phobia. The science is not fully settled. Some replications fail. The clinical translation is still a work in progress, but the principle is real. If memory is reconstruction, then reconstruction is not just a source of error. It is a source of change, the same process that lets your brain fabricate a cornucopia also lets your brain update a trauma. The same lability that makes memories vulnerable to distortion also makes them amenable to therapy. The reconsolidation window that Nader discovered does not care whether the new information being integrated is a misleading word from a researcher, a meme from the internet, or a corrective emotional experience delivered by a clinician. The mechanism is the same. The question is what you put into the window. Hugh Everett wanted to believe that consciousness persists, that somewhere in the branching wave function, every version of you survives. His daughter believed it too. In the end, she asked to have her ashes thrown in the garbage so she could find the right parallel universe and meet her father. The physics does not support this. There is no mechanism for consciousness to leak between branches. There is no evidence that the universe preserves you or your memories anywhere outside the 86 billion neurons that encode them. When those neurons die, when the synapses that hold the patterns dissolve, the memory is gone, not stored in another timeline, not backed up in a simulation. Gone, And yet, those neurons, while they are alive, are doing something remarkable. They are constantly rewriting your past in the service of your present. They are editing the story of who you are so that it remains coherent, useful, and navigable. They are sacrificing accuracy for meaning. And meaning, it turns out, is what you actually need. Nobody needs a perfect recording of their wedding day. What they need is a version of it that feels true, that connects to who they are now, that gives them something to build forward from. And that is exactly what the brain provides: imperfect, reconstructed, endlessly revised, and functional. The Mandela Effect reveals that the machine is imperfect, that it sometimes produces outputs that are demonstrably wrong, shared across millions of minds, defended with total confidence. The Berenstain Bears have always been spelled with an A. The Monopoly Man has never worn a monocle. Curious George has never had a tail, and you would have sworn otherwise, and you would have been wrong, and you would have had no way of knowing. But the Mandela Effect also reveals something else. It reveals that the imperfection is shared, that brains running the same software, fed the same cultural inputs, applying the same schemas, arrive at the same errors. There is something strangely human about that. The errors are not random. They are patterned. They are predictable. They tell you something about how human minds are structured, what they expect, what they fill in when the details are gone. The Monopoly Man gets a monocle because we have a schema for wealthy gentlemen. Curious George gets a tail because we have a schema for monkeys. The cornucopia appears because our brains expect abundance to come packaged in a recognizable form. We are not cameras. We never were. We are storytellers, running on 20 watts of power, constructing a continuous narrative from fragmentary evidence, and doing it well enough to build civilizations, write symphonies, send spacecraft to other planets, and fall in love. The story is not always accurate. It is sometimes dangerously wrong. It has cost innocent people their freedom and cost guilty people nothing. It has torn families apart over memories that were manufactured in therapy. It has made millions of people certain about a cornucopia that never existed. But it is the only story we have. In 2022, when those researchers at the University of Chicago showed 100 people pictures of the Monopoly Man and Pikachu and Curious George, nearly half of them drew the wrong version from memory, even after seeing the right one. Seeing the truth was not enough to overwrite whatever was already in their heads. That finding, more than any other, captures what memory actually is. It is not a record of what happened. It is a construction of what your brain believes should have happened. And once the construction is in place, even direct evidence to the contrary cannot always dislodge it. If your memories are not real, how would you know? You would not. And the 86 billion neurons that build them will never tell you. They will keep reconstructing, keep editing, keep presenting each new draft as the final version, with all the confidence and vividness and felt certainty that evolution has equipped them to produce. The Mandela Effect is not a glitch in reality. It is reality. This is how memory works. This is how it has always worked. And the most unsettling thing about it is not that you have been wrong about the Berenstain Bears. It is that you will never know what else you have been wrong about, and neither will anyone else. And tomorrow, when you remember this, even that memory will be a reconstruction, different in small ways from the experience you are having right now, edited by whatever happens between now and then, faithful not to what was said, but to what your brain decides mattered, and you will remember it with absolute certainty.